His signature was on the last deal the US struck with Iran back in 2015, the deal that was ripped up by the current US President, Donald Trump. But is today's Memorandum of Understanding any better? We'll hear from the former US Secretary of State, John Kerry, and what he makes of these current negotiations.
What is it like to negotiate with the Iranians? And was the JCPOA really flawed? Trump promised unconditional surrender, but he has already allowed Iran to begin exporting their oil. Funds that may soon be flowing to the Iranian war machine.
Secretary Kerry, welcome to the Security Brief.
Great to be with you.
The Strait of Hormuz has become the defining issue in this negotiation, which it was never meant to be. Did the Iranians hold that over you in 2015? Did you discuss the threat internally? And was there a contingency plan if they did close it?
No. Well, when you say, was there a contingency plan? If they had done something that threatened the entire foundation of what we were trying to do, which anything with the Straits of Hormuz would do, of course there would have been repercussions. And we had any number of options. We had every single military option, every single diplomatic option available to us. But our calculation, the calculation of President Obama and our whole team of CIA, DIO, we had people involved in almost every single cabinet. Our calculation was that before you get into some of those ancillary issues about, which are not unimportant, specifically Hezbollah, Houthi, missiles, we calculated that we'd be there forever. And you would never get resolution of the nuclear weapon. At a time when we were being told by our intelligence community that they were about 2 weeks out from a breakout capacity. So we took that breakout capacity from those 2 weeks to more than a year. And during that year, during which time, already before Donald Trump pulled out, the Chinese intelligence, Russian intelligence, German, French, UK intelligence, and the Israeli intelligence agreed with our CIA the deal was working, they were living up to it, there was no reason to go to war or threaten, and we needed to continue down the path we were on. President Trump stepped up. I don't know whether it was his own intuition or his own fantasy, or I can't tell you what it is, but he just arbitrarily decided he was going to pull out, most likely because it was something done by President Obama. And that was the moment where all things Obama were being pushed aside.
Secretary, I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's been little or no communication between yourself and the Trump administration. And we spoke to Baroness Catherine Ashton last week, who thought that that was odd. What is it like to negotiate with the Iranians from an insider's perspective? And what advice would you impart if the Trump administration did ask?
Well, obviously they haven't, and they won't, and I'm not sitting around worrying about that at all, except that you'd think that when people have had a certain experience and others are going out to repeat it, you might want to know what they've learned. That said, this war, and I think this is a really important point to put on the table right up front.
Sure.
This war, which has everybody entangled now, all the world paying higher prices, everybody worried and wondering about where this is going, absolutely did not have to happen. This was a war of choice by maybe 1.5 individuals or two, that being President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Well, obviously had a major influence on it. So when the Prime Minister of Israel, sitting in the Situation Room, went through what would be gained and what would happen, there were members of the President's own cabinet who thought that was BS and said so. But the President said, sounds good to me. And that sound good to me is what set us on this path to war.
And illegal?
Of course it's illegal, because it's a war. It's not a police action, momentary kind of thing.
Do you believe some of the commentary in the United States?
And the President, by the way, they've all used the rhetoric of war. They acknowledge it's a war. Congress yesterday, the Senate, the United States Senate passed legislation, amazingly, to say he's got to stop it. And they referred to it as war, stop the war. So I think that you got to be realistic about what is going on here. You mobilize half the fleet of the United States, and you put aircraft carriers and all kinds of different capacities in the region, in the field of battle. That's clearly stepping beyond some sort of an instant reaction in the interests of our own security.
We are where we are. What do you think is missing from the Memorandum of Understanding?
Maybe it'd be easier if you asked me what's not there. Or
I thought you might say that.
What is there? Well, the most significant thing of all is really any kind of real pathway that is laid out and accepted to to prevention of achieving a nuclear weapon, number one. And number two, obviously, the Straits of Hormuz. Now, the Straits of Hormuz, if all of a sudden people are paying large sums to go through, that should be unacceptable to the administration. It's a question of whether or not it will be. You can't take this asset that belonged to everybody in the region and around the world who went through those straits, and never, up until now, has Iran weaponized it. They did now. When we were negotiating, they never even discussed it. There was never a sense of that's where we're going to go. There was a confidence we're going to try to get to where we need to get to succeed, and not how do we break this apart.
So they've discovered that leverage as a result of the war.
More than discovered it, they claim they own it. And that is going to be a very serious question going forward. I guarantee you that Arab countries in the region, that will not sit well with them. And it shouldn't sit well with any American or anybody in the free world. Why all of a sudden should international waters be just seized by a country, whether they've been attacked or not, and made into this ping pong ball between the two nations? Shouldn't happen.
To the point on Iran getting a nuclear weapon, I'm just going to go a little bit further on that. At no point in these decades of negotiations have Iran given up the right to enrich. So what do you do about that?
Well, you have to respect the law, or at least most people have to respect the law. And the law is very clear with respect to the whole issue of international protocol for reining in nuclear weaponry, which we've done ever since the 1950s, late 40s, and which we all understand very well. Under that process, Iran would not be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon on security bases. But more importantly, they were under no circumstances allowed to enrich uranium and go beyond those levels of bomb capacity.
3.67%.
Well, we limited them to 3.67% because that worked in terms of what might be a legitimate enterprise with respect to medical research or something else. But no, it's physically impossible to be able to make a bomb when you only enrich to 3.67%. It's impossible at 20% and 30%, higher percentages. But obviously we were trying to prove to the world that this is really limited, really restrained. But what's important is the larger picture of what we did to get to a place where we could accept one provision or another that might be a little less than you wanted, et cetera, because we had so many backstops in other places. So we actually limited them in their capacity to maintain enriched uranium. We limited their capacity to be able to experiment with metallurgy or other things in certain other reactors. We destroyed a plutonium reactor that they were about 2 weeks from bringing online, commissioning. We filled the calandria of that particular weapon with cement. It could never be used again. We limited them on anything they could do with respect to plutonium. We had cameras put in every facility that had anything to do with enrichment or the possibility of making a bomb. We had cradle to grave restrictions on uranium, and we followed every ounce of uranium that was mined and then traveled to be put into yellowcake, then used, and then into waste. We had 130 additional inspectors put on the ground in Iran, looking every single day, inspecting at will. They were not allowed to use the other two nuclear facilities, Isfahan and Fordow, in addition, which was under a mountain, and which we had inspectors going in and looking at. We had a capacity, if we suspected that they were doing something outside of the parameters of the agreement, we had the right to demand inspection. And we had a process absolutely laid out which made it crystal clear exactly what step you can take, day one, day two, where you go, and how you demand properly to go in and inspect.
You can see why it's 160 pages now, can't you?
Well, and also it's extraordinary to listen to you 10 years on and to know that level of detail. And I wonder if that level of expertise is anywhere in the room in Switzerland. But moving past that, what is upsetting the hawks in Washington, you'll be well aware of this, is the money that is already flowing to the Iranians. The oil waivers are there. And it can't be lost on you that the reason he ripped up your document, your detailed definition of what the problem was, is because it gave some money to the Iranians, which he said was going to the ballistic program.
Well, 300 billion is what he is talking about using to rebuild Iran. Evidently, we're going to have a Marshall Plan for Iran instead of for a lot of other countries that need it, despite their behavior. But more importantly, the reality is that they could not possibly have made a nuclear weapon without our knowing it. That's the key here. You could pick a point you want to argue with, like the money went in, but please focus on this. The money that was in our agreement was about, I think, somewhere around 1.78 billion. 1.78 billion. What he's talking about giving the Iranians is 300 billion. And the money that we gave them was their money, not ours. It came from a deal for weapons back in the 1970s when the Shah was still there. So the Shah didn't get his weapons, but he paid for them. So when the new administration came in, they went to court and they won. And they won on the interest that would be applied every day that went by that you didn't get the money. So in protecting the American taxpayers, President Obama thought it was better to put the 1.8 billion on the line and gain the credibility to be able to do the other things you needed to do that constrained Iran's behavior. Now here's another very important point that a lot of people aren't aware of. Ayatollah Khomeini actually went out on the limb supporting the negotiations and trying to get an agreement. And the people who opposed getting an agreement, who didn't want any negotiation, who told the Ayatollah, if you negotiate with the great Satan, you will regret it. Well, the great, Ayatollah Khomeini said, no, we're going to do this. We're going to find if we can set up a structure that works for us and works for them. And he took political flack for that internally.
And in removing him.
And well, before you even get to removing him, but when he was, when the IRGC came in and hot and heavy saying, what are you doing? You're negotiating with the great Satan. The IRGC said, well, we want a nuclear weapon. They did want one. So there was legitimate reason to be concerned. But then the first night of bombing, I guess, the first weekend of bombing, took the life of the Ayatollah and his wife and a daughter or his son, I forget which. And, it's pretty hard to turn around and say, hey, let's cut a deal now. Let's have, we'll talk and sit. Everything's okay. Moreover, President Trump really missed the greatest opportunity of all, which was to open up the potential that without war, you could actually reach an agreement. Where is the negotiation? Where is the trod path here of him putting proposals in front of Iran and saying, hey, I didn't like this in the JCPOA, but if you'll change that with me, then we can cut a deal that goes beyond where they were, and here are some other things we could do. I mean, there was none of that. That's diplomacy. And war is the failure of diplomacy. And this war is a gigantic failure on a number of different levels, not just failure of diplomacy, because there was no diplomacy. Although actually, in fairness, there was a proposal put on the table, I believe, to Mr. Kushner and Mr. Witkoff a few days beforehand. Yeah. And that proposal, I am told, I haven't seen it, I'm told was pretty forward-leaning. And President Trump just chose to ignore that and proceed to go to war.
So, 20 months, JCPOA, purely focused on the enrichment issue. Now, there's nothing about Iranian ballistic missiles or proxies that destabilizes in the region that we know of. We'll have to wait to see if that becomes part of the negotiations post the MOU. But from your perspective of negotiating on nuclear enrichment alone, what additional challenges does including ballistic missiles and proxies come with?
Well, first of all, we didn't want to just do the nuclear. Would have loved to done the others. But for instance, on
why didn't you?
Well, a number of things. On Iran's attitude towards Israel, it was very clear they didn't even want to talk about it. So there was no beginning there. And it was very hard to come in and do what you're going to do regarding the Houthi or regarding Hezbollah or regarding the missiles if you're not able to actually get going in a comprehensive discussion where you can resolve the problem. So our calculation, the calculation of President Obama, of our Secretary of Defense, of the National Security Council, of the other negotiators, Ernie Moniz, who was our Secretary of Energy, Wendy Sherman, who was Deputy Assistant at the State Department, a huge team of people agreed if we start going down the Hezbollah missile line right now before we take away a nuclear weapon, we could just get diddled and taken down the pathway and we'll never get to all those issues. But we cited them. We made it crystal clear to Iran, we were not going away after this deal. We made it clear that there was an ongoing negotiation that would happen almost immediately, and that was regarding the missiles and regarding the relationships in the region. And we thought that with the absence of a nuclear weapon and Iran in a place where they are actually complying with it, that there was an invitation there for people to perhaps be more thoughtful.
Build trust.
Build trust. Build a relationship at least. And we had a different, Ronald Reagan in Reykjavik with Gorbachev, where they tackled nuclear weapons writ large. They went there just to kind of find some kind of an agreement. And these two leaders wound up saying, why don't we get rid of all the nuclear weapons? And they actually announced that was their goal. We went from 55,000 warheads facing each other. Russia and, it was still at that point early on.
Soviet Union.
And the United States had all these warheads. And we managed to go down to about 1,500 or so, a little bit below that. It's still too many.
Yeah.
Still destroys the planet more than we need to have a fight. But
trust and verify.
We said no. We changed that. We said don't trust and verify.
Right.
Because you really were never going to persuade anybody that you could build the trust necessary or be able to go forward. So we proceeded, in a really conservative, safe way, to say we've got to be able to have people believe that this can work. And we're asking, not for trust, we're asking for access. We're asking for a predetermined agreement as to what happens if they did break it. They would agree to what the process would be, and they did. They agreed to the process for rectifying a judgment that we might make that they're cheating. And we had that built into this agreement and signed. It's part of the agreement. And one other really important thing, if you're going to go to war, it really helps to have a few people who are supporting you.
Yeah.
We had nobody. Not only that, we didn't consult with our allies.
Yeah.
They just went to war.
Can I?
And in the process, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say just on that issue, just to expand that a little bit, because can we briefly touch on NATO, because there's a huge ambiguity at the moment on U.S. commitment to the alliance. We've been looking at that on the program about what the United States might lose if they withdrew from European bases, the loss of intelligence that is critical to submarine movements, that kind of thing. But from an inside perspective, from someone who is deeply inside like you, what are we missing here? What is critical for the United States in that alliance?
The survival and long-term security of Europe and beyond Europe, Ukraine, other challenges in the world where there is fascism and breach of all standards of international decency. I think that your word is critical. Your behavior is critical. And people read all those tea leaves. And it's really important to send the right messages. President Trump has obviously not sent those messages. But I think Europe understands, from senators and congressmen alike, that is not the sentiment of the United States. and it would not pass the United States Senate, in my judgment.
And yet, to listen to Secretary Rutte last week, the Secretary General, he couldn't assure us that the assets currently being withdrawn from NATO countries would return in an Article 5 scenario.
Well, unless the United States just literally stuffed it on the idea of living up to their agreement, that would be correct. I mean, I don't believe that. I believe the United States does stand behind Article 5. I believe the United States writ large absolutely supports NATO. And I think people in the United States are outraged by what President Putin has been doing, by the nature of this war, an invasion against all principles that we tried to stand up for post-World War II. I mean, diplomacy, it's not just a one-day thing. It's not a, look in the box of that folder and you get the picture. It's about personal relationships. It's about countries and their long-term relationships. And I think Americans care deeply about our relationship to NATO and to Europe.
But just on the diplomacy thing, diplomacy is most effective when you've got a big stick to back it up. So going back to the question on what would the US lose from an operational perspective, so losing that big stick, you already alluded to it, 10 operational tours, I am or was the blunt end of foreign policy. So when that operational level of capability starts to diminish across Europe, that means that the US's foreign policy, whatever it may be, it will be harder to enact that foreign policy. So from an operational perspective, what's the bit that we're missing that will hurt the US most?
Well, I think, this is ironic to say, but to have a president who, against, I am convinced, the majority of the House and the Senate of the United States, advocating something as damaging as taking away, if he were arguing that. I don't think he's arguing that now. I think he's playing, some pressure moments and making choices that are temporary and of the moment. I think that the United States, writ large, Republican and Democrat alike, senators and congressmen, take pride in the history of our engagement for the betterment of the planet. And if you look at World War II, when we came out of World War II, there was very little. There was very little economic, there was very little in terms of structure and diplomacy. And Harry Truman, President Roosevelt started it, and Harry Truman, we put together the UN, we created international organizations, the International Court, because rule of law is absolutely essential to keep the worst things from happening on this planet. And I think that what Ukrainians have been able to do, what Zelensky has been able to do, is really quite remarkable. And, for one thing, warfare has changed forever in these last months. A lot of people haven't even sort of stopped to think about that. But unmanned, unpersoned aircraft and vehicles are something that is going to replace, and robots are going to be on that battlefield in many cases.
And they are.
And you will have, and already are, and you will, yes, they are. And you will have just a transformation in therefore how you think about deterrence and how you think about long-term security of your country. When I met with President Putin once, he complained to me bitterly about the number of missiles that were being put in the backyard of Russia, allegedly to deal with Iran, but obviously capable of being turned and pointed in another direction. And he said, as long as you're doing that, you're affecting my sense of security, my capacity to conduct a first strike, which is part of deterrence. And so, I was really struck by it. And he talked to me about President Bush making this decision. And he said to me, he said, President Bush made the decision, put the missiles there, and I told him I will have to respond. And I said, well, what do you say to that? And he said, do what you have to do. Now that's coming from President Putin, not that's from him.
Wow.
But we did what we had to do. Everybody did what they had to do, based on perception. And a lot of diplomacy, a lot of kinetic actions can happen when you're not thoroughly thinking through all of what got you there and all of what could happen if you engage in that way.
Secretary Kerry, it's truly fascinating to hear your account on Iran and on Russia and NATO. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us on the Security Brief. Thank you very much indeed. Just a reminder that all the back episodes of the Security Brief are on the playlist on YouTube, and you can send us your questions and feedback on our conversation with Secretary Kerry. It's there on the email security.brief, in fact, at bbc.co.uk. That's security.brief at bbc.co.uk. We'll see you next time.